welcome back to the SKOL Cast, where we are two brothers who happen to be Vikings fans and are once again reminded of the turmoil of being a Vikings fan. We'll get into that. My name is Asher Whitmer, my brother Christopher Whitmer. I don't know if we've ever told people, I'm hailing from Colorado and you are in Philly. We've talked about you being in Philly, but I'm hidden away in the foothills of the Rockies, somewhere obscure.
Broncos country.
Yes. So I forget how it came about. I forget if Teresa asked them, but after the Vikings lost to the Lions, there was conversation around whether or not the boys would switch to Broncos fans if the Vikings don't win the Super Bowl or if they get knocked out of the playoffs. And one of them said a very heartily no. Why? Never going to cheer for the Broncos. So I have no clue what their disloyalty to the Broncos is, but at least we're safe from them swapping over to the Broncos. Now, I guarantee you, if the Rams beat the Vikings, they'll switch to the Rams bandwagon and kind of ride them as far as they go. But
no, you can't switch to the team that beats you.
Well, to them, I think there's definitely like this sort of I don't know if you call it existential or like identity of like who we are, because they've never lived in Minnesota, so it feels kind of weird to cheer for Minnesota teams. The other day, did I tell you about I think it was just Saturday night at our dinner table. Adrian was there and we were kind of winding up, and he's like, Dad, I got a question. Do we have to be Twins fans? So
I mean, it's supposed for them. It does make sense because the Rams have always, basically in their lives, the Rams have always been in LA.
Yeah. When did the Rams move?
I think it was like 2016.
Was it 16, 15 or 16?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think Jared Goff was drafted in St. Louis.
And the other thing is they remember the Rams Super Bowl. Like I wasn't, that was just as I was, well, no, we were back. I was back into following in 21. I don't know why I've never been a huge, I cheered for the Rams that year because the Chiefs weren't in the Super Bowl, but I've never had
the Bengals
a super big allegiance to the Rams. Although I am somewhat of a Matthew Stafford fan, I do kind of enjoy watching his journey.
Yeah.
So maybe to start off here, since we are post regular season now, we'll look at our picks, which was not a pretty week for us. We probably should have taken a little more seriously some of the teams that sat their starters and so forth. I don't know. Have you heard the conspiracy around the Chiefs?
Yeah, but I don't like, was it that I was listening to who said, was it a Locked On podcast where they were saying like for NFL teams, they kind of, they don't think so lowly of other teams as we do. And so it's like, would the Chiefs rather face the Bengals or the Broncos? Like it honestly probably isn't as big of a difference in their minds as it is in our minds.
Yeah.
And so if that's true, then still, I imagine they were like, I'm guessing the rest that the Chiefs had, the ability to rest, the ability to not show any of their cards is probably more valuable than whether or not they play the Bengals or the Broncos.
For sure. I'm just looking at like 38-0. That is the most humiliating game of the whole season. Of all, it just shafts their point differential for one thing. Was there?
Which they probably don't care about.
The Packers shut out who did they shut out?
Was it Vegas?
The Vegas or Saints? I can't remember.
One of those black.
But it's like I'm unconvinced that the Broncos offense is that good. And was the Chiefs offense, even with their backups, that bad? Like that's what, like, I agree with you. I don't think they're specifically losing that game so that the Bengals don't get in, but it is just such a lopsided score from some surprise teams that.
Well, that's where I wonder too if they were even just like playing. I have no idea because I don't watch film and I'm not a football guy, but if they were not even running plays that they would rather not put on tape.
Oh, I see. I get it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's look at our picks. We both went 7-9. We differed in 2 places, and you were correct with the Bengals, and I was correct with the Colts. Both of us were wrong 9 times. None greater than that final game Sunday night with the Detroit Lions. So on the season, I go 173, and those who are really keeping track, this does not include week 1. So the totals don't match up to what should it be? 172 or 272 games. 83 to 82, and Christopher's at 160 to 95. So, yeah, anything more you want to say on that, on our picks, on our record?
I was very close. I forget if I mentioned this last time or not, but I was very close to picking Chicago.
Yeah.
And
yeah, that one didn't surprise me. Like, obviously,
yeah,
it's whatever, but
it felt like one of those games where it's like Chicago's not gonna get swept. I mean, they got swept by everyone, but like it just felt like one of those games where it's like, they're a good enough team, they'll probably like grunt one out.
Yeah.
The Chiefs and the Broncos were another one where we probably should have known better.
The other thing is, I sort of had this inkling that, Rodgers will probably do really well and the Jets end on a high note, but I still picked the Dolphins.
Yeah.
So that ends our picks on the season. What do we make of now? We're recording this on Thursday. The game was Sunday night. Vikings versus Lions, the biggest game in. A lot of people were saying the. I guess they weren't necessarily saying the biggest regular season game, but the highest stakes, like more is at stake between the Vikings and the Lions. I really felt like, and still kind of feel this way, that the winner's definitely the favored. I think the take is the winner of that game goes to the Super Bowl. Now, since the Vikings lost, it's like it'd be really nice to find a path. So I'm digging back throughout history and realizing, Tampa Bay in 2020, well, it would have been January of 21. Correct? Was it January of 21? Anyways, when Tampa Bay won the Super Bowl with Tom Brady, they were the number 5 seed in the NFC. And so it's like, there's hope. But the downside is that, as you pointed out, that game, or that playoff, did not have fans in the stands, so there's not the home field advantage. Now, on the flip side, I guess I haven't dug into it real deep, but it looks like there's a possibility that the Vikings-Rams game could be switched in the location due to the fires that are happening. And Is that a real thing, or is it just kind of some speculation going around?
Well, so yeah, there's some speculation, and then um, the um, the NFL put out notice saying like we're continuing to monitor the situation. If it does switch, these are our contingency plans.
Interesting. Yeah. So one of the locations that was floated was Arizona, and obviously this is just kind of bird's eye Twitter view, but
Yeah,
somebody reported, I should have marked who reported it, but said there's a lot of Vikings fans in Arizona. And so that would be kind of an interesting turn of events if they would go to Arizona and the Vikings would have more of an equal showing of fandom than maybe what was there in
yeah,
Inglewood.
yeah. It's obviously I don't want to make light of tragedies that are happening in LA, but like
Yeah.
there would obviously so interesting to know because I imagine anyone who has tickets would have like first dibs to like transfer those tickets to the Glendale. But I would imagine a bunch of them would end up selling, and it would probably be a little bit easier, even though it's further for them. It'd be a little bit easier for Minnesotans or like local Minnesotans to get to that game than for Angelinos. I imagine there's not a lot of Rams fans outside of LA in that part of the country.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Obviously, like
that,
even if it's in LA, I would be interesting to know like how many Angelinos are really even in the mood to go to a game right now.
hmm yeah. And there's a decent uh, Vikings have traveled to LA well. I don't know if they're
Yeah.
just in Southern California or if they're fans from Minnesota that travel out there, but it is one of those cities it tends to be one of the cheaper cities to fly into for one thing. And so if you do want to go to a game, but all that to say, there's never been outside of that in the last, I think I went back 10, maybe 12 years. There's never been really anything outside of 1 or 2 seed that wins the Super Bowl. The flip side is there's never been a 14 win wild card team who was 7-1 on the road. So, the hope of Vikings fans out there is if there's anybody, and this is really what a lot of people were saying about the Lions too. They were undefeated on the road. If there's anybody to do it, to go on the road and win a couple playoff games, like these are probably the two teams. But I guess just before we hit recorded, we were talking about this a little bit, and Christopher, we were discussing how long we're going to do the podcast. If they lose next week, do we continue going through the playoffs? And Christopher's like, well, I imagine we'll be doing the podcast up to the Super Bowl. And we chuckled, and I'm like, I have my confidence in the Vikings being able to win in the playoffs has really taken a hit. And I think part of it is that game was just so different than anything we've seen all season long. Like even their 2 losses, you look back, and I know like Lions fans are going to hold this one over the Vikings, and rightfully so. Like I would if the Vikings had done something to the Lions. But it's funny how many people want to take all the stats of this game and just like throw that in our face. Go back and look at the first game the Vikings and Lions played. Sam Darnold played great. He played tremendous. And if he played, I would have said he played a tick worse against the Rams. With how the defense played on Sunday night, if Sam Darnold played like he did against the Rams, I think the Vikings win Sunday night. Sam Darnold was just plain awful Sunday night. Now, he didn't throw any picks, but that's just kind of the thing that I look at.
His aim was so poor, I don't think anyone could have.
He was overthrowing even the defenders that could have intercepted it. Yeah, what is kind of your take? That's kind of my initial thought. Maybe we can get into some of the analysis and stuff. There's definitely people out there defending Darnold, which is warm-hearted.
Yeah.
Maybe putting more blame on O'Connell for not changing scheme or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think O'Connell was probably somewhat shook at how bad Darnold was.
Yeah. I think for the most part, Darnold has been able to reel Darnold in or like calm him down. And I think that just never happened. I think so. A couple times. I think a lot of my positivity, probably honestly, just I'm feeding off of some of the like podcasts and people that I listen to. So like Locked On and like, Phil Mackey, are still like fairly positive. They're not like, oh, we're still going to the Super Bowl, but there's a certain amount of like snapback to reality. I think that, some snapback to reality actually is probably in our favor. Like obviously having that like automatic win with the first round bye would have been nice. I honestly think that the Lions needed it worse than Vikings did. And I think that, go ahead.
Can I jump in just to that point? Like, I do think I was a little nervous about it going up to the game, just hearing Vikings talk. It's like, it's just another game, it's whatever, as opposed to hearing Lions talk. Like, Lions prepped to win that game. And I do think they had more to lose if they lose it. I think, I mean, it'd be kind of nice to see them go one and done in the playoffs anyways. But I think they would have lost if they had to turn around and play right away after losing at home.
Yeah.
And that would have been such a rough way to end the season. So I think in their players and the coaches and everybody, obviously in the fans, but I think there was a lot more for them riding on that game than maybe even the Vikings. But anyways, continue with your.
I think the Vikings, all season long they've been saying it's just 1-0, 1-0. We just have to go 1-0. And I think that I think O'Connell was trying to keep even just like the expectation level down, where it's like our whole season is riding on this game, and I think that the fear was that hyping it up, and it still was hyped up, like no doubt, players and coaches and everybody knew what the national narrative was about the game. And so and again, like maybe I'm just being too positive, but I don't mind being positive. I
Be positive. Help me flow back to the surface.
I think that even that whole dynamic could be good, where it's like it had the feeling of a playoff game without this is what someone on Score North said. I think it had the feeling of a playoff game without the consequences of a playoff game. And so Darnold get his shakes out, and now they could go in with a better plan of, all right, how are we going to respond to like this, this dynamic. Obviously, like the fact that, like, I would rather, someone like Mahomes or whatever, seems like he's never phased. He's never shaken. And so
except when he plays the GOAT, he's lost to the GOAT twice.
Yeah. And so, like, you would rather have someone who can, and Darnold honestly has this personality, which I like, kind of this like emotionless, but he definitely seems to get frazzled on the field, which is what it is. I think that's just what it is with Darnold. And I think that's another reason why you probably don't pay him a lot of money if you're the Vikings. I think that, oh shoot, there was something I was going to say about the game. Now I forget it. But yeah, I think that, what were we talking about?
Yeah, Darnold. What all lies on Darnold? Like, to your point, this was Darnold's biggest game ever, and really,
Yeah,
to be honest, the last 3 games have, I would say, have been each, like, now that he played the Lions Vikings game, that Seattle game wasn't his biggest game, but when he went into the Seattle game, it could be argued that that was the biggest game he had ever played as far as playoff. Like, that's when it started feeling like this is playoff atmosphere.
yeah,
Seattle's playing for the playoffs. They needed that win. Once the Vikings
yeah,
beat them, that kind of squished them out of the playoffs. There was
yeah,
still a sliver of hope, but um, and he played well. That's when he put up the wobbled highlight, the dime down to Jefferson. And then you go into Green Bay, and that was probably the next biggest game that Darnold's ever, like, he's played for trashy
yeah,
teams, and you could blame it on, well, Darnold's a trashy quarterback or whatever. The reality is he's never played in games with this kind of stake,
yeah,
let alone everybody's saying this is the biggest, highest
yeah,
stakes regular season game. So I completely agree. And I think that's probably where my confidence, like, I do feel like, this feels like repeat of the
yeah,
midseason. They lost to the Lions. They're going to go lose to the Rams. But
yeah,
the thing that's kind of giving me confidence is I think the reason he was so bad is because he's never played in this and he gets
yeah,
frazzled. The confidence is a couple things. He's shown throughout the season that he has a short memory.
yeah,
And I think O'Connell, Flores, everybody does really well at bouncing back from mistakes. Now,
yeah.
they can't have 2 bad weeks and then bounce back. They got to have,
Right. This is it.
this is it. But yeah,
I think, to the point of Apollo, just like the thing that I think about, and people that say I've been making excuses for the Vikings all year long. I just think that this team, I have a hunch that this team is as good as its record. Maybe, maybe, maybe not better. Like, I do think that the Lions are the better team, but I think that, like, we were in it with the Lions, and honestly, we weren't that far away from the Rams loss. Honestly, like, our worst game was this game and probably the Jacksonville game, which we still won because Jacksonville was terrible. But um, think so. I have a lot of, like, you look even at this game, it was terrible, but the reason it was terrible not because, like, the defense held the best offense in the league to, what was it, like 10-9 or 17-9, within reach. I forget exactly the scoring, but within reach up until, like, the end of the third quarter. And that
it was
game
10 and
was with it was
yeah,
rough.
it was in the last 7.5 minutes of the third quarter that the Lions scored to go
Yeah.
17-9. Yeah. I forget
So,
when
like,
it was exactly, but yeah.
this game could have, like, even with that fourth quarter, like, it could have turned around. 17-9 is not insurmountable within one quarter. Um, we had all three timeouts left, all the way up to, like, 5 minutes left. Um, I think the you know there is kind of a butterfly effect where it's like, well, if the Vikings would have scored here, then the Lions would have scored. Like, you can take that both ways. Where the flow of the game, if 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 the Vikings would have been getting touchdown, the entire flow of the game would have changed. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to know, like, well, if he would have just landed this completion or that completion, but he missed probably 5 touchdowns. Like, we made, what was it, um we, 4 red zone trips. We had 2 turnovers. The Vikings had no turnover. Like, the Vikings had 2 takeaways and no giveaways.
No giveaways, yeah. We did turn.
Go ahead. Did we turn over on downs?
We turned over on downs 3 times, but
that's what I'm saying. Like those were like in those even, turnover on down drives. If Darnold would have had the accuracy that he has had the entire season, those would have been touchdowns because Jefferson and Addison Hutchinson was wide open. Cam Akers made a breakaway. What was it, like 40-yard run? Like
58.
We had opportunities. There was this solely Darnold's inaccuracy that gave the game away. And you could say that like, oh, I wish O'Connell would have changed, and maybe he will in this next game. But I do kind of think that you live by the sword, you die by the sword, in the sense that the whole thing that has worked for Darnold and O'Connell this year has been O'Connell's unwavering belief in Darnold.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't just let that go the moment Darnold starts feeling wildly, because like that is the moment when you have to believe in him. And I think it was like the turnaround from like when he looked at Darnold after the Jacksonville game, it was like, we still believe in you. It's like, you probably shouldn't have, but that is the sword that O'Connell is living by. And you can't retrospectively go back and say, well, he should have adjusted in the Lions game because it didn't work that time, like you don't really get to choose when you're going to have confidence in Darnold and when you're not. If that is the thing that is driving your team, then you just got to stick with it.
Yeah. And you bring up a good point. So many of the analysts after the Packers game were highlighting, like, this is some of the people who were saying you need to pay Darnold. We're talking about how when O'Connell needed to close out the game, when you need it most, he put it in Darnold's hands. And then you come back the next week and you're criticizing O'Connell for putting it in Darnold's hands. Like, if they're going to go deep in the playoffs, you got to be able to put it in your quarterback's hands and he gets the job done. So just like the Vikings may not go deep in the playoffs because Darnold may not be that guy, or at least that ready for that level. Like, but I don't necessarily fault O'Connell for several things are at play. First of all, for what we're just discussing, like it's got to be Darnold to pick the team up and at least show up. At least you don't have to be that Seattle or Green Bay hero, or even against the Falcons, Arizona, like he did phenomenal in some of those games. You don't have to be that. It felt from the very get-go, it felt exactly like the Chicago game, the whiteout Monday night Chicago game, where Chicago did a really good job at shutting down their deep throws, and he was forced to do mid passes, which he airballed. Like, he's not good on mid passes. The difference is they switched to a run game and they just ran the ball down Chicago's throat. And I was kind of shocked because it felt like their run game wasn't so bad, actually. But Aaron Jones only had 48 yards, and he was out basically 2 quarters worth of the game. Haven't really heard. I haven't tracked a lot with the team this week. Just kind of taking some personal time to grieve. But they like, Jones wasn't much part of the game, and so I don't know how much that factors in. But precisely what you're saying, like, I've been wrestling with this all week long so far. In the game, watching it live, there were 3 touchdowns that Darnold would have normally nailed that he missed in the first half. It should have been 21-7 going into the half. And the reason I say 21-7, because I don't think you give a bad... I'm guessing Reichert was trying to squib the football a little bit. There was a little bit of time left on, and he ends up kicking it out of bounds instead of having it bounce and run time off. I don't know. Maybe it was just a bad kickoff. I just kind of assumed that's what it was. So if you're scoring touchdowns, you're not going to do that. You're going to kick it into the end zone. They probably don't quite make it down into field goal range in time. Maybe they do. So at any rate, it could be 21-10. I think it very likely could have been 21-7 because the 3 missed, he overthrew. Maybe they were all to Jefferson in the first half. I can't remember, but there were 2 different sides of the end zone. He way overthrew it, and then he hit Jefferson.
Hawkinson a bunch.
He hit Jefferson, and Jefferson missed it, dropped it like that. Those are just things we don't see. You don't see Jefferson drop a ball. You don't see Darnold overthrow. And just like even for Jefferson, this is his Jefferson and definitely Addison, even Hawkinson. Like these guys have never played in such an intense, high stakes game before. Yeah. And how much of this is just so they probably should have toned down their cockiness ahead of time. Like, yeah, nobody can block me or, whatever. It's like, you've never played in a game quite this level. Respect Detroit. Detroit's really good. They've got a lot of depth, but, and so here's the thing. I started to say this. I didn't complete it. What I'm processing is, was this all Darnold just really bad? Was it Aaron Glenn, the defense, really good? And the thing that I wrestle with is when you look at, and some people continue to say Aaron Glenn shut him down. They just weren't open. And I'm going to talk about the jamming and holding and no PI calls in a little bit. But there was a lot, when you look at everything and what I saw live, like there actually were a lot of times where guys were open. And Darnold did, like I didn't come away feeling like, man, they just locked down our wide receivers. No. Darnold just missed on the chances he had. And normally he's hitting on those chances. He's maybe trying to throw it in tight sometimes and it's an incompletion. But then when it's wide open, especially on deep throws into the end zone, like that's where Darnold has excelled all season long.
The brilliance of the Lions was their blitz, like their pressure on Darnold, and it is like putting pressure on Darnold does risk letting our incredible receiving core open. So that's the risk. And with a little bit more calmness from Darnold, I think we could have just posed him. But their brilliance was making that calculation and saying, we're going to just throw everything at Darnold, and he proved him right,
Yeah. So what I think we talked about, or I mentioned last week, that it's going to be interesting to see, did Ben Johnson leave more off tape or did Brian Flores leave more off tape? We totally neglected Aaron Glenn because what it looked like to me was like, I'm not so sure if Minnesota reviews that tape and they meet up again against Detroit. I think Minnesota has a better plan. Detroit might still win, but it's not a 31-9 blowout. The different, like, it struck me as everybody just kind of being shocked that this was Aaron Glenn's scheme, as though they had prepped all week long for a different scheme. And Darnold's out there needing to make decisions, and he's like, "This is looking different than what I'm prepped for." Like, and that's the brilliance of Aaron Glenn. Yeah. But it didn't necessarily strike me, other than just the grit of this is, what are they, three rows deep into their defensive depth chart, but their defense didn't strike me as just this complete shutdown domination. Even the fact that they never forced a fumble, never pulled an interception, like the completion percentage, it speaks for itself. But that's just kind of how it struck me. It was like, I don't think they've had any of this kind of tape prepped for, any of these looks prepped for.
The other thing too is if Andrew Van Ginkel would have come down with that pick, it almost certainly would have been a pick six. And
he was wide open. Yeah.
And that, like, I don't know how fast he was. I think he had a ways to run yet, but
that's true.
But it probably would have been a pick six. That would have not only given us points, but it would have killed moment. It would have had points for that. I forget how that drive ended up, if they got points up with that or not. But it would have killed momentum for them. I mean, that's so like a pick six is so just like disheartening.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought about that with the pick six, but also the first two offensive drives for Detroit were not pretty. And actually, quite frankly, like the final score is 31-9, but I would say the game was played like a 22-9 win for the Lions. Like the reason they were able to get 31 points is because Minnesota's offense was so bad. They gave them good field position several times. And the defense,
special teams.
Yeah, and the defense played really, really well. I thought they did a better job of shutting down. I know Detroit gets 31 points off them both times, but I definitely like the way the defense played better this time.
Yeah.
The first two, Detroit had one of their ugliest games as well. They just happened to come out on top. The first two offensive drives, Minnesota looked better than Detroit, but it's a huge momentum shift. Like, can you imagine if Minnesota had responded after going 3-and-out for Detroit? If Minnesota responds with at least a field goal, and then Detroit goes 3-and-out again, and they respond with at least a field goal, and Minnesota's up 6-0. Now I know that hasn't stopped the Lions at all. I'm not saying that would have won Minnesota the game. I'm saying, to your point of momentum shifting, the fact that none of those 3-and-outs to start the game hurt the Lions. Like, it's only a matter of time then, especially because the Lions have such a good run game that they wear down the offense and begin to break through.
Yeah.
What are you how are you feeling as we look at Monday night, against the Rams? So Minnesota, instead of 5 days of rest, Minnesota gets a full 7 days of rest.
Feels big.
What are you looking at? Who are you picking? Like, what you think they're going to continue to win? I mean, just for a little bit of fantasizing here and whatever. If Jalen Hurts cannot go, or even if he can go, and he's been in concussion protocol and he's still whatever. I mean, Philadelphia's good, so they're probably going to win. But there is a scenario where you could see the Packers pulling one over the Eagles. I almost think the Commanders are better than the Bucks. In which case, then Minnesota plays at home against the Packers if they win against the Rams. Wouldn't that be nice?
That would be nice. But then we're on the wrong side of that sort of adage, which I don't even know that that's accurate, but where it's hard to beat a team 3 times in a single season.
With the Packers. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
true.
But
I don't even, I feel like I heard a stat the other day that kind of disproved that, that actually teams that swept in the regular season went on to beat them in the playoffs. I don't actually know. The only thing that gives me doubt about like the Philly Packers is how is Hurts doing? How is Love doing? Both of them were injured.
Yeah.
Hurts is probably not as injured as they've made him out to be, just because this is kind of like they're scooching in a little bit of rest before, So the problem with Hurts is, what I'm saying, is probably not so much his injury as much as his rust.
Yeah.
And then however Love is doing.
So I'm just.
Go ahead. You're looking.
I went down a rabbit trail here. It looks like sweeping teams in the regular season based off of 24 playoff games since the merger, are 15-9 in the playoffs against that team. So that is actually
But they still go on. The
they still go on to win. Yeah,
is wrong. I mean, it makes sense if you think it. Like, I get why people say that it's hard to because it's the NFL or whatever. But if you're a good enough team to have beat them twice in the regular season, it makes sense why you would still be better. After a grueling season. So I forget what the question was, but I can just keep talking about this team.
I just threw that scenario out as a way of,
Oh yeah,
there is a scenario. I mean, that would be upsets all around. All the lower seeds would be beating the higher seeds, but which I don't know if that's ever happened.
So I think there are some scary teams. Like, there are some teams on here that could get hot. I think the thing that's in Minnesota's favor is that because of the way the NFL is, I think defense becomes more important the closer you get to the Super Bowl. And I think we have a good defense and we have a healthy team. The thing that hurts teams going into the playoffs is that they're worn down, they're tired, they're not healthy. And so games become more defensive heavy, and just an overview of all the NFC teams aside from Detroit and Philly, I think Minnesota's the better team of all of them. But because it's the NFL, you're 1-0. Like, there's no series, there's no whatever. Like, if you have a bad day, you're done. Like, and so because of that, I think the Rams and Tampa Bay could upset Minnesota. I think if Jordan Love is healthy, I think they could upset Philly. It seems unlikely though, especially with Christian Watson out and stuff. Like, everybody's depleted. I don't know that Philly is actually that depleted other than Kurtz's concussion, and I think he's not good to go. So,
other than Brandon Graham, I think Philly's actually probably more healthy now than they were earlier in the season. Yeah.
So yeah, that'll be interesting. It probably is Philly, Detroit, Philly, Minnesota in the championship game. Would be my guess.
Philly, Detroit, or Philly, Minnesota.
Yeah, I don't know if it lines up to work that. Like, I don't know. Minnesota, Philly might end up playing each other sooner. I'm not sure how that works out.
So if the Commanders would beat the Bucks, then Minnesota and Philly would play. If Minnesota beats the Rams, they would play. So I guess my question, like, I'm very skeptical that Minnesota is going to beat the Rams. Like, I'm sitting here like, I don't know.
They are the scariest team, I think.
What? Yeah, like they're the one team. I think that's the thing. Like, so much of the season projections went exactly as I thought. Roughly thought they'd go as the season progressed. Just to back up, I thought they'd go 10-7, not 14-3. But the one team, even as the 5-win streak developed at the beginning, the one team that I was always nervous about was the Rams. And then sure enough, like, that was probably the ugliest game of the season until this final game. And so I find myself a little nervous in that regard. What do you look at? What gives you confidence that the Vikings could go into SoFi and beat them?
I think the longer prep time, we're still coming off of Detroit, but I mean, honestly, we didn't play very hard in Detroit. We might get more rest this.
That can be the narrative. It's just like, hey, they were just, it was their way of getting rest for.
Yeah. Although I don't actually think that they did end up getting rest.
I was surprised how close the total offensive plays were. It felt like Detroit, maybe had 70 and Minnesota had 45 or something, but it was 62-66. That was pretty close.
The snaps.
Yeah.
Offensive snap. Oh, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, no, going into SoFi, so like I have some things that give me confidence, some things that give me doubt. So like what Flores said about not being prepared, like that they were surprised. I don't think he said we weren't prepared. He said they were surprised that Puka Nacua played. I remember being surprised too. Like I remember thinking, oh, he's probably not going to play, and then the day of it was like, oh, he's playing. Um, it feels like that gives me confidence. It also, worries me a little bit because it feels like a professional football team should be ready.
Should be prepared.
Um,
Yeah.
and so there's part of me that's like, okay, I get that, but also like, really, um, so that's like a positive and a negative of like, okay, not only do they have more time to prep than they did last time, they, um, they they also are going to be preparing for like the fullness of the Rams offense. I also think that they have more tape with those two on this year, with Pup and Nakua on together this year than they did in week, what was it? 4, um,
Week
7,
8.
8. And so like both Pup and Nakua, like if you remember, like Cooper Cup there was like trade rumors. And if Minnesota would have won, like Cup probably would have gotten traded. But they came out and they played really well. And now they've had a whole season putting tape on. So I feel a lot more confident in the defense. I think Stafford is still formidable. I think that if Darnold can play like he was playing Green Bay, Seattle, etc., I think that we win. If Darnold is shaken again, I think that the Rams stuff will win. I think something that gives me pause is the whole like disaster situation in LA and like how that will affect the teams. I imagine, you know,
As in, could that be a rallying piece around them or what?
it could either be a rallying piece. It could also be super disruptive for the Rams. And there's a part of me that just like feels a little bit gross about playing in NFL games at all.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure there's people in that organization who have been like deeply affected by the fires. But like, it is what it is. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to just see how that works out. But yeah, like it could, yeah, like how will the home field dynamics shift? Um, I feel like it's not going to be more disruptive for the Vikings than it would be for the Rams. Like I just can't imagine that losing your home field advantage would end up being worse for the away team. You know, um,
Sorry, say that again. You're saying if
what
they would
once,
relocate, you don't think that'll
yeah,
be
if they would,
disruptive for the Vikings? It'd be more
like,
disruptive for the Rams.
I would think so. I would
Yeah.
think anything that's going on would be more disruptive for the Rams than for the Vikings. If anything, it feels like it would probably end up being better if the Rams were traveling. If they were leaving LA, which I guess could end up kind of being what happens. I just think that the likelihood of the Rams winning probably is not improved by the situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like all those dynamics are like, it's not great, but also like it's not. I don't think it's a bad thing to have like sources of joy in times of trial. Could be good for people and stuff. But it also is definitely puts into perspective, I'm sure, for a lot of people on that staff. that's not what we're talking about right now. But yeah, that's just a complete unknown that kind of makes me wonder, like, how is that going to affect the game?
I saw some people likening it to the 2009 Hurricane Katrina, but that was not 2009. I'm positive I saw somebody say that. But when did the Saints win the Super Bowl?
That was the season the Saints won the Super Bowl. I think
what
the
hurricane
Super Bowl
was it?
Actually, I think it was Katrina. Like, I think it was the first season, maybe, that Katrina they were back in the Superdome.
I thought Katrina was 2004.
Yeah,
but you're just saying the whole. Long.
Yeah, I still think that like, so Katrina was like 2004, 2005, whatever that was, and then the team played, I think, a couple of years outside of New Orleans.
That's right.
And then Breeze came in and like they ramped up and became a better and better team. And I think it was still kind of riding off of the devastation. Like, this was the first couple of, like, 07, 08, 09 were the first couple of years where the city was kind of feeling like it was coming back together. And then it was like a couple of seasons into them actually being back in New Orleans. So I think they played in Atlanta for a few years.
Interesting.
Was it Atlanta? Somewhere. I think they played outside of the city for a few years. While New Orleans kind of got back up on the feet. So yeah, I think 2009 definitely felt like a culmination, like a good feeling culmination. It also makes me think of Houston Astros the year they cheated.
But with the
what was the hurricane or flooding or something?
Yeah, no, it was, what hurricane was that? Why is it slipping?
I forget.
Yeah. No, I remember thinking about that because that was like August, and I remember thinking like, oh, this is going to galvanize them, and they go on to win the World Series, and then everything comes out about their cheating as well. But I don't know what won them the World Series.
It's like a double whammy for the people of Houston.
Yeah.
It also makes me think of like the Jets and Giants playing football like the week after 9/11. Obviously, like, very different circumstances, but there's just been many times where sports has been kind of a rallying point.
Yeah.
It could also become really gross too if it's not handled well. Where if all people care about is like the bottom line or whatever, then that's like, if it becomes like a rallying point of like reprieve in the midst of suffering, then it can be really, really motivating.
So, I mean, I don't know. I'm guessing our 9 viewers are aware of the fires in Southern California, but there are two specific, maybe even 3 by now, fires that are just really doing damage. One in Pacific Palisades, which is out along the coast north of Inglewood. Oh, not that far north of Inglewood.
Yeah.
Maybe what? Is it 10 miles? I don't think it's even 10 miles north. Maybe it is. I kind of forget right offhand.
Yeah.
And then there's a couple, I think there's 2 different fires that are getting the Altadena area, which is inland a little further. But both of those are destroying neighborhoods in ways that I mean, we lived in Southern California from 2000. What was it? 2008? When did we move out there? Why am I drawing a blank? 2009?
Yeah, 2008.
2008 through 2022. I have never witnessed fires damaging neighborhoods. Like, I'm familiar with the neighborhoods that we're seeing pictures of just being totally devastated. We have friends, we have a sister who's still living there who has friends, coworkers who have lost homes and so forth. I think the Pacific Palisades fire has been called the worst natural disaster in LA history.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a significant blow to people in Southern California. I mean, you see images where it looks like I mean, even in the middle of day, it just looks all dark and flames just billowing up. And there, at one point, people were having such a hard time evacuating. A bunch of them got out of their vehicles and just got out on foot, which then locked down the neighborhoods, and they had to come in with these big bulldozers and just plow vehicles out of the way so they could get the firefighters in there. It's crazy. And just how fast. I think that's the thing that struck me is, when did Christy first talk about the fire? What are we at? Thursday?
Yeah,
Was like, it Monday or Tuesday?
Felt like, a couple days ago.
And now it's just like blown up, out of control. And I do think I heard somewhere where one of the places in the Hollywood Hills that was evacuated, they were okay with people coming back in now. So I'm not sure how things are going on, but yeah, it'll be interesting. Obviously, it's not that's significantly more important than sporting events and what happens with the Rams or the Vikings. There's other things going on in other parts of the world as well, but it'll be an interesting week, or what are we at now? 4-day period here to see what I think the number one relocation suggestion was up in Santa Clara, if I got that correctly. And then another, I think it was a secondary option, but Arizona was the next. One article I was reading made it sound like Santa Clara was the first option, but I'm assuming it's easier if they stay in state than handling sales taxes and playing and all that. Did you?
Sure. Yeah.
Did you know? This is talking about going down rabbit trails, but did you know that professional athletes, have to file taxes for every state that they play in? I never knew that before, but I just
really.
Yeah. So
isn't that the whole point of like people going to Florida and stuff? Is because it's no income tax.
Yeah, I mean, half your games are going to be played at home, so you have
that's fair. Yeah,
you have no income tax. But yeah, if you go and play in Arizona, or if you go and play in Colorado or whatever, California, like you have to file for that game, whatever money you played, or whatever money you got from that game.
I mean, they have enough money to hire accountants. So
I was watching something it was like a college professor talking about economics, but he was using a professional athlete as an example of how, like, these outrageous contracts, but then setting a proper expectation of what the player actually takes home for their pay, which is still like significantly more than
a lot.
what 98% of American people will ever make. But yeah, it was just kind of an interesting talk.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Were you guys?
I forget what I was talking about. I was talking with someone recently about like the different expectations you have for like when you're giving an example of how wealthy someone is, and it'd be like, oh yeah, like they're doing this, and maybe someone says like even someone at 850,000 a year does this. And I'm like, that was your example of like, I would say like someone at 250,000. Like, that would be my example of like how a wealthy person would behave. But you went to like nearly 1 million. So like your perspective of like a normal wealthy person versus my perspective of a normal. But I think about that when people talk about Brock Purdy and how much he makes and how little he makes, and it's $850,000
a year.
Like,
but he's due. Excuse me. He's due what? 65. Like, people estimating he could make a $65 million contract for what would that be?
Yeah, unless his play the last few games hurt him.
Yeah. I've seen a bunch of San Francisco fans comparing. That was the meme, I think, that got, or the picture, the graphic that got me the most. People compared Brock Purdy's game against Detroit just a week before against Sam Darnold's game against Detroit. And they're like, it was San Francisco fans, but they were saying like, "Hey Purdy, don't ever compare Brock Purdy to Sam Darnold again."
Oh, geez.
It's just like, okay, if you're going to cherry pick one of Brock Purdy's better games of the season with Sam Darnold's worst game of the season, like, hey, let's go look at what Brock Purdy has done against the Rams or Seattle.
Yeah,
it's been pretty ugly as well. But
or Minnesota.
Yeah, or Minnesota. But I was just like get a divisional rival, because that's a more apples to apples comparison as opposed to this inconsequential, like the game against the Giants. I always want to say the 49ers for the Lions was probably the least consequential game of their season. And so Aaron Glenn's not pulling out his new defensive scheme against Brock Purdy. Like he's Oh, you were talking about people comparing like 800,000. I was reading, this was last spring sometime. I was reading an article about like what it takes, what kind of income you need to have in order to make it as a 4-person family in each state. And Colorado, whoever wrote this article, I don't even remember what media outlet I was reading this article off of, but a 4-person family in Colorado needed to have a $253,000 income, like an average of, in order to make it in Colorado. And I was just like, what the world? Like, we have a 7-person family living on less than $90,000 a year. I mean, 2024 is right around $80,000 for us, and we're doing fine now. Yeah, I would like more to be able to do more, to be able to save more and stuff. But it's just like ridiculous that we're at this stage of because that's disheartening to anybody who's looking at moving into the area or whatever. Like, I got to make $250,000 in order to make it as a 4-person family. It's ridiculous. Anyways, I don't know. Do we want to save? I don't know. So obviously, I think next week, coaches that are currently still coaching can be interviewed, like can have conversations with teams who are looking for head coaches. And so there's been a lot of talk, particularly around Brian Flores. He's received 4 requests, I think, to have interviews. And if you're familiar with football, you're probably aware of the Brian Flores journey. He was in Miami, didn't go well. There were things that went on that led him to sue the league, and that is still in ongoing litigation. And so there's, and not only that, but then this year Tua came out with some comments about Brian Flores, and then just recently Ryan Fitzpatrick, I think just yesterday maybe, Ryan Fitzpatrick was on a podcast and aired some of his grievance against Brian Flores. Do we want to dive into that now, or is it still going to be live news next week? We could kind of cover it then, or
probably still going to be live news, I would guess.
Yeah. I think the thing, just to like posit this out there, is obviously by Brian Flores' own admission, Miami was not his best. He was not at his best as a coach. Ironically, he actually did really well for a franchise that was trying to tank. That's part of what the lawsuit was about. The owner was offering to pay him to lose games, and he didn't want to do that. For a franchise that was trying to tank, he did really well. And for a franchise that couldn't get going offensively, they did really well as a team. And largely because of his defense as a coach. what's strikes me as odd, and this is maybe what we can discuss next week more, is first of all, it's been interesting to me now that he's been with the Vikings for 2 years, how little he's recognized. Like this year, by the end of the year, like people are starting to recognize. But you'll go like he'll have a fantastic game, and people like in the analysts, like the media world, won't even mention him. And then it feels a little odd at the way players and even people, maybe it's not just players, but sort of feels like they go out of their way to bash him, and then in their bashing, like they leave out context, all kinds of context. And so it's, to me, it's kind of a weird scenario, and it's just like, I wonder how much is like the fact that he has a lawsuit against the league playing into media, how the media talks about him and interacts. I don't know, but we can talk about it more next week, maybe.
Yeah.
Unless you have some immediate thoughts here.
Oh, it's one of those things where like there's clearly he did something, clearly he wasn't a great like culture builder. I think my initial questions are like, but like, is someone who has a similar coaching style and comes from a similar tree, like Mike Vrabel, like, is he a better culture builder? Maybe, I don't know. Like maybe Brian Flores just had a really big ego when he was in Miami. He seems very different now, even from my perspective. But then hearing players talk about him, the players in Minnesota love him. I maybe after the third year, or whatever, maybe they won't, or whatever. Maybe that's when it breaks. But it seems odd that there's so much bashing of him going on right now. It feels like maybe he's an easy target, a safe target, and like maybe players aren't expecting to need to ever be on a team that he's coaching. Because it feels like, people probably wouldn't bash Mike Vrabel because they might want to play for Mike Vrabel someday. I mean, from all accounts, he seems like a very hard coach as well. Belichick was certainly a hard coach. I mean, and people bash Belichick too, but
yeah. And I think that's part of the conversation is just what's happening to the Belichick coaching tree. Like, are any of those guys I think Vrabel is probably the closest to getting a job, but are those guys going to get jobs? Because I mean, you have is it Josh McDaniels who was in Las Vegas, Brian Flores,
the Broncos before that,
Vrabel, I mean, those guys are very similar. They're very much that way as well. And it seems like the league is shifting away from those kinds of guys. I don't know.
Yeah.
But why don't we could pick that conversation up again next week as we hopefully are discussing the things that played into the Vikings win over the Rams. Well, I don't know. My confidence is so shaken because I was so sure we were going to see some different things, and I generally feel like defensively we did. We saw again, like if Minnesota plays the defensive game, this is the best offense in the league. Like they did their job. So on that portion, I can kind of be like, I was seeing correctly. I did think, but man, did the offense just fall apart? And hats off to Detroit. They came in prepared. It'll be fun to see what happens because I do think Minnesota is very well coached. I think Kevin O'Connell deserves Coach of the Year. in spite of a whole host of Minnesota Twitter fans who are just like, fire O'Connell, fire.
That's so ridiculous.
It is so dumb.
People are so like, look at the worst teams in the NFL. Like, I'm not even joking. Just like absolutely trash teams are the teams that churn through coaches.
Yeah, absolutely.
Number one, they probably don't know how to hire well, but then they don't know how to just be patient. Like, that's great.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, we will see you all again for another episode for sure as we review the what is it called? Super Wild Card. Why do they do that? Why do we have like Super Wild?
I don't. Do they still call it? I think they dropped the Super this year, but it used to be.
Rich Eisen keeps calling it Super Wild Card, but he always is like Super Wild Card.
They used to actually call it Super. So Rich is riffing off of a clip from an old movie where the guy says Super. That they play on the. They used to brand it as Super Wild Card Weekend because when they added the 7th seeds, so like before the top 2 seeds used to both get buys. So you had, so when you added the 7th seed, you added 2 more games to the weekend. And so then to play it up and stuff, they were like, oh, it's Super like Wild Card Weekend.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Whereas now it's like we're 3 or 4 years into it or whatever it is by now. And so it's like old hat. This is Wild Card Weekend. This is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We'll see how it goes, and maybe we'll be over the moon excited, and the Vikings are going to win the Super Bowl next year or next week, like
next month. Yeah. All right.
We will see you all then.
See ya.